and you won't be stuck with what you've got now. But real change comes from your values, and there are big differences between us. I believe that we need to do more to help families. They are the absolute bedrock of a strong society. I want government to be accountable. I want less waste, less bureaucracy, stopping the jobs tax, but making sure we have good public services that you get good value for money for. As we're going to discuss tonight, I want us to keep our defences strong, I want to keep our borders secure and our country safe. But real change comes not just from politicians, but from when we all recognise that we have responsibilities. We're all in this together, and that's how we'll build the big and strong society I believe we need in our country.
Thank you, Mr Cameron. And finally in this round, Nick Clegg, the leader of the Liberal Democrats.
I am so proud of the values that have made our country so great. Democracy, human rights, the rule of law. But the sad truth is that in recent years, our governments under the old parties have let those values down. We shouldn't have sent soldiers into battle without the right equipment. We shouldn't be facing allegations of complicity in torture. We shouldn't have invaded Iraq. So I want us to lead in the world. I want us to lead in Europe, not complain from the sidelines. I want us to lead in creating a world free of nuclear weapons. And I want us to lead on the biggest challenge of all, climate change. Now, my family knows what British values really mean. My mother was freed by British troops from a prisoner of war camp. And I think if we do things differently, we can be proud once again of the role we can play as a force for good in the world.
Thank you, Mr Clegg. Now, those are tonight's opening statement. Now it's time for the questions from the audience. The audience here is made up mainly of local voters from the southwest, some with allegiances, others yet to be persuaded. And there'll also be some questions in person from Sky News viewers who emailed us. Each leader has an uninterrupted minute to answer each question, followed by a second minute to deal with what their rivals have said. Then it's free debate time with no guaranteed time at the microphone. Now, our first question comes from Christopher Nelms, who's from Salford, near Bristol. Mr Nelms.
Hello, I'm Chris Nelms. I work in the building trade. I can't see any advantage of us being in Europe. I think there's far too much interference politically and legally, and I just wonder what you intend to do to stop it.
How are we going to tackle Europe, David Cameron?
Well, very directly, Christopher, I think we should be in Europe because we're a trading nation, we're part of Europe, we want to cooperate and work with our allies in Europe to get things done. But I do agree with you that we have let too many powers go from Westminster to Brussels. We've passed too much power over, and we should take some of those powers back. I want us to be in Europe, but not run by Europe. And you'll hear big differences between me and the other two parties. I don't want us to join the euro. I want us to keep the pound as our currency. I don't want us to give up the British rebate. I want to make sure that we get value for money for what we put into Europe. I want to cut some of the bureaucracy, some of the rules, some of the regulations that I think drive business so mad. That's the agenda you'd get from a Conservative government in Europe. And to those who say somehow this would be isolation, I say nonsense. President Sarkozy of France, he stands up for France in Europe. Angela Merkel of Germany, she stands up for Germany in Europe. I would do exactly the same for Britain in Europe.
Thank you. Nick Clegg.
I actually worked for the man who was sent by Margaret Thatcher, would you believe it, to bat for Britain in Brussels. And what I learnt when I was there was this. The European Union is not perfect. Of course not. I mean, this is a club that took 15 years to define chocolate in a chocolate directive. Anything that takes 15 years to define chocolate is not a model of democratic and efficiency. But what I also learned was this, that there are a whole lot of things, whether we like it or not, whatever your views on Europe and the European Union, which we simply can't do on our own. We can't deal with international crime, which touches and affects every single community in this country on our own. We can't deal with climate change on our own. The weather doesn't stop at the cliffs of Dover. We can't regulate these wretched banks that got us into so much trouble in the first place, which now sprawl across countries. I don't think the European Union is perfect. I want it reformed. That's why I want to lead in the European Union. But we're stronger together and we are weaker apart.
Mr Brown.
You know, there's 3 million reasons why we need to be part of the European Union, and they're called jobs. 3 million jobs depend on our membership of the European Union. Half our trade is with the European Union. 750,000 businesses, I'm sorry it's not your business, raising the question about the building trade, but 750,000 businesses trade with Europe. And the idea that we should again be isolated and on the margins and not in the mainstream of Europe would be a terrible, terrible mistake. Now, I worked with the European leaders through the global financial crisis. I had to persuade them that we had to restructure our banks and they had to restructure their banks. I had to persuade them that they had to work with America in the G20. But when Europe and America works together, we are so much stronger. Stronger to deal with climate change, which is one of my priorities, stronger to deal with the economy, stronger to deal with international crime, stronger to deal with terrorism. Let us never again be an empty chair in Europe. My fear is that David's policy would put us in that position.
Thank you, David Cameron.
Well, I understand why people like Christopher are very frustrated about the European Union and some of the things that have happened. And I think one of the reasons that people are so angry is their politicians at Westminster have given away powers to Brussels without asking us, the people, first. And I think people felt particularly cheated when the European Constitution came forward and we were told we were going to get a referendum, and Gordon Brown and Labour stopped that from happening, and Nick Clegg and the Liberal Democrats didn't vote with us to get that referendum. We should have had one. People feel cheated by that. And as a result, one of the things I would do if I was your Prime Minister is straight away pass a law through Parliament that says if ever there's a future occasion when laws are being proposed to pass power from Westminster to Brussels, there would be a guarantee of a referendum held in our country. You send us to Parliament to make decisions, to make laws, to discuss the issues, yes. You don't send us there to give away powers that belong to you. There should be a referendum guarantee if ever this happens again.
Thank you. Mr Clegg.
David Cameron talks about a guarantee. It was the Conservative Party that gave a cast iron guarantee to have a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, which it promptly dropped. Look, we do need to have a referendum, I think, the next time there's a big transfer of powers to the European Union, but it needs to be on the fundamental issue. Do we stay in or do we go out? You have a right to make that choice in a referendum. I would argue we should stay in, not because it's perfect, but because I think it's in our interests to do so. Let me give you, Christopher, a very concrete example. There was some time ago an operation by European Union police authorities which broke open a paedophile ring. They arrested 100 sex offenders, many of them in this country, and they released over 20 young women from unimaginable abuse and servitude. It was something called Operation Koala. You can Google it and look it up. Guess what? Conservative MEPs, UK Independence Party MEPs, voted against the measures which made that possible. That is putting dogma above the safety of our children. We are safer together, we're weaker apart.
Gordon Brown.
Well, you know, imagine a European Council meeting if David Cameron was in charge 2 months from now. And he'd have to go along, as he said, and say that he wanted to repatriate the social chapter. That's what gives us paid holidays. And he'd have to break up the European Union meeting and say, look, 26 of you are against this. I'm the only one who's standing for this. And what would happen? We're trying to get an economic recovery. That depends on Germany, France, and other countries growing as well, taking our exports. We're having to get an agreement on climate change because of what happened at Copenhagen. Again, that would be postponed because we'd be having a big argument, as we did in the past with the Conservative government, about repatriating powers to Britain. We've got other problems we've got to deal with, and these include security and terrorism. These are the issues. Let's look to the future. Let's not have a Britain-only solution, and let's not go back to the days when we were fighting with the rest of Europe in the past.
Gentlemen, over to you now for free debate.
What I would say is what you're hearing from the other two is, frankly, don't trust the people. Don't ask them when you pass powers from Westminster to Brussels. Just give in to everything that comes out of Brussels and don't stand up for your country. No. That, to me, is the same old politics. Let me just ask this important point. This idea that somehow an in-out referendum is what the public wants, I don't think is right. It's a con. What people want when a new treaty comes along, when a constitution comes along, is to have that choice to vote on that constitution.
Let's be clear. What would have been a con would be to have a referendum on one individual treaty, which even if we'd had the referendum and then we'd rejected the treaty, would have allowed, Christopher, the European Union to carry on exactly as before. Let's have the fundamental debate. I worked in my previous life, before going into politics, for a while as a negotiator on behalf of all of us, on behalf of Britain and the European Union, negotiating trade deals with the Chinese government, the Russian government and others. And what I noticed there was that the Chinese and the Russians, they only listened to what we were saying because I was representing the largest single market in the world of 475 million consumers. Of course there are daft rules, of course it does daft things, but it seems to me that we punch above our weight when we stand together in Europe, in a world, frankly, where you've got a lot of superpowers bumping up against each other and where, to coin a phrase, size does matter.
You see, David wants a referendum if there's any future change. Nick wants a referendum now on the European Union. I think what people want is us to solve the employment problem, the economic problem, and get on with the job. And I need to work with these other countries in Europe, President Sarkozy, Chancellor Merkel. David's walked away from the European People's Party, which is an alliance of the centre progressive parties in Europe, and gone in with a group of right-wing extremists. I want to work with the sensible people in Europe to get jobs for our British economy. If we don't trade with Europe, we lose jobs, we lose businesses, we lose growth. Let's make sure our priority is trading with Europe, sorting out the problems of the European Union, yes, but let's make sure we get a recovery that's stronger than ever.
You can hear there is a difference. There's a real difference between us. And the reason about this European party is I just think it's the hypocrisy that people are fed up with of British politicians standing here in Bristol saying, I'm going to stand up for us in Europe and we shouldn't give away all these powers and we should fight for British interests. And then over they go to Brussels and they do exactly the opposite. I want to make sure that we say the same thing when we're in Bristol about wanting to be in Europe but not run by Europe, wanting to have a single market that's good for our country, wanting to trade with Europe, but not go over to Brussels and say something different. It's that, the same old politics.
How on earth does it help anyone in Bristol or anyone else in the country for that matter, David Cameron, to join together in the European Union with a bunch of nutters, anti-Semites, people who deny climate change exists, homophobes? That doesn't help Britain. Of course we need to change the European Union, but you change clubs of which you are a member by getting stuck in, not standing on the sidelines and complaining about things.
What the Liberal Democrats have actually done.
I think
you know who
these
two guys remind me? They remind me of my two young boys squabbling at bath time. And they're squabbling about whether to have referendums on the European Union. What we need is jobs and growth and economic recovery. We work with our partners to get that. And the sooner Nick realised also we had to work with America and Europe to get economic growth in the future, the better. I'm afraid David is anti-European, Nick is anti-American, and both of them are out of touch with reality.
It's not a question. It's a question of wanting to get things in Europe for your country and standing up for your country. And one of the things the Liberal Democrats would want to do is actually take away Britain's seat on the United Nations Security Council, and replace it with a European one. And that's one of the things that actually gives us the ability to punch above our weight in the world. It gives us influence in the world. And I think that's a huge
final
mistake.
quick word from, first of all, Gordon Brown, then Nick Clegg.
Well, there is no chance of Britain giving up its seat on the United Nations Security Council. We are stronger. We've just been chairman of the G20 as a result of the efforts we made in the economy. We're leading the negotiations on climate change, and we're leading on nuclear.
Final word. I would simply say, don't let people create scare stories to frighten you into thinking that we can't change Europe. Of course we can change Europe. I, unlike David Cameron and Gordon Brown, have been in there, have sought changes. We can do it if we lead.
We're going to have to move on now.
Complain on the sidelines.
Now, question B comes from Stuart Walvin from Horfield in Bristol. Stuart.
Thank you. Given our involvement in Afghanistan, if there is another multinational operation to remove Al-Qaeda or another terrorist group from a failed state, would the UK participate?
So, will the UK take part in future multinational operations against terrorists abroad? Nick Clegg.
Well, clearly, the principle of the reason why we went into Afghanistan, why I supported our mission in Afghanistan, unlike the illegal invasion in Iraq, is to keep us safe. It's not to sort of parachute democracy into Afghanistan. It's because we believe that if you allow Afghanistan to be a haven of extremism and terrorism, there will be more terrorist attacks here in Britain. So from that principle, if we need to do that again, we should. The problem, of course, is that we've done it in a manner where I don't think we've pursued the right strategy, we haven't given the right equipment to our troops, we haven't had proper international coordination on the ground in Afghanistan, we haven't worked properly with other countries in the region to do so. I think if you put soldiers into harm's way, you either do the job properly or you don't do it at all. So if we ever take that decision again, let's make sure we've got the right equipment, the right strategy, so that they can come back, having done the job we've asked them to do with their heads held high, knowing they've done the job well.
Thank you. Gordon Brown.
I want to answer the question directly. Let's be honest, and Nick didn't say this, we've already got Al-Qaeda in Somalia. We've already got problems with Al-Qaeda in Yemen. We are having to take action with our multilateral partners to deal with these problems, and will continue to have to do so. So why are we in Afghanistan, and why have we got to be vigilant all the time? The reason is there is a chain of terror that links these al-Qaeda groups in different parts of the world to action that could happen in the United Kingdom. And you know, every week I get a report, sometimes every day, of terrorist plots, most of them which arise in the Afghanistan-Pakistan area, and we have got to deal with. So to keep the streets safe in Britain, we have to take on al-Qaeda wherever it is. I also have to say about Afghanistan that this is a mission that can work. And the reason is we are training up the Afghan soldiers and the Afghan police. So whenever we're in a mission abroad, we've got to make sure that we have a means by which in that country we can build up their own security staff so that we can bring our troops home. That is my mission and that is my aim.
David Cameron.
Well, Stuart asked, would we participate? As I was your Prime Minister, I would want to think very carefully what's in the national interest. What will make us safer here in the United Kingdom? And I think we need to end the division between sort of foreign policy and security policy and Home Office policy. Bring it all together and think about our national security. But I would also say this. If you look at future operations like that, we have to learn from the mistakes of the past. We've got to make sure that we plan properly. We've got to make sure we never send our troops into battle again without the proper equipment, without the proper helicopters. We have to think through not just what we're doing militarily, but actually, is the aid there? Are we helping these people? Do we have a political strategy for how we're going to get out of that country once we've tried to make it safe with our allies? I think in the case of Afghanistan, far too many of those questions weren't answered. And even now, while I support what we're doing and I want it to work, I still worry we're not doing enough to get the political situation right in Afghanistan.
Mr Clegg.
Well, I think everybody's agreed that if we were to do this again, which is Stuart's question, we need to make sure that we've got the right equipment, the right resources. And that's why I think it is essential that after the next election, whoever wins, there is a full defence review. So we have a real good look at where we're spending money, whether we're spending that wisely, and whether we are providing the troops on the front line with the resources they need. I personally think that we're not spending money on some of the right things. I wouldn't carry on spending money on the Eurofighter Typhoon, the third tranche of that Eurofighter project, consuming billions of pounds. I don't think it's right to do what both David Cameron and Gordon Brown want, which is now to commit, before we even need to make a decision, to spend up to £100 billion renewing exactly in the same old way, the Cold War Trident nuclear missile system. If you take decisions like that, then maybe we can equip our troops so they don't get so terribly overstretched as they were in fighting two wars on two fronts in Iraq and in Afghanistan.
Gordon Brown.
My first thoughts will always be for our troops, for our dedicated forces, for our professional forces. And every day I meet people who have got people serving in Afghanistan or have served in other parts of the world. And we've got to do everything we can to support them. Yes, there will be a defence review in the next Parliament, so we can do our best by our forces. But look, what happened on Christmas Eve was a bomber who would have been in Detroit and bombing that plane, came from Somalia. That was really where he was given his orders from. So we have got to deal with al-Qaeda in Somalia and Yemen, as well as in Pakistan. And we've got to be clear that we cannot allow terrorists to have territory in the world that then they use as a base for attacking the United Kingdom. I will do everything in my power to protect people, but we rely on the most brilliant, the most dedicated, the great forces that I want to pay tribute to this evening.
Well, I completely agree with Gordon Brown about the bravery of our forces. I mean, I've been to Afghanistan 4 times. Every time you are just blown away by the professionalism of these people. I actually, to prepare for this debate, I went for a run this morning with someone who just got back from Afghanistan. I have to say I couldn't really keep up, but he was someone who'd served for 6 months and had done an incredible job there. But just going back to this point about how we get these things right, one of the things that strikes you when you go to Afghanistan is that actually we're not getting the political situation right. The south of the country is where the Taliban grew, where they came from. That is the Pashtun part of the country. And yet when you see the Afghan National Army, it is dominated by people from other parts of the country. And there is a really big political issue there. We've got to make sure the whole country in Afghanistan feels it's part of the Afghan government. And that's absolutely key for making sure we can bring our soldiers back home. Not just training the Afghan army and police, as Gordon has said, vital though that is. We need a political settlement as well to help make sure we can come home.
I mean, I think what Stuart's point, which he's sort of really pinpointing, is that even if we as a country decide to undertake a mission like that again, there's no point deciding that you want to do it unless you also know how and unless we can provide the necessary resources. I remember when I was in Helmand visiting the troops there, I talked to some mechanics who look after the vehicles, and they were telling me that a convoy. They'd been on a convoy just previously, which normally just takes 1 day to get from one place to the other. It took them a week, because every time any of the vehicles broke down in the sands there, they didn't have the necessary parts. They had to take parts from other vehicles. So if we ever do this again, we cannot allow 8 years to elapse, which is what's happened, until proper equipment is finally being provided to our very, very courageous servicemen and servicewomen.
Look, we've had to change our tactics all the time because of what the Taliban has been doing. Originally, they wanted to win a face-to-face war with us, fighting person to person. Now they use explosive devices. And these explosive devices are designed to scare as well as to maim our own troops. We have had to change our tactics and therefore bring in the explosive experts, bring in the metal detectors, bring in the drones to survey the land, make sure we have the proper intelligence, go into Pakistan and deal with the making of bombs as well. All these things have had to happen. And we've had to change our tactics again because we want to train up the Afghan police and army. So we are partnering with the Afghan police. Now, I'd like to say to our troops, come back into the barracks and you'll be safe. But I can't say that because our strategy in Afghanistan depends on contact with the local people, persuading them that they are safe with us and safe in an Afghanistan free of the Taliban. So we've had to change, yes, but it's in response to the tactics of our opponents.
I'd just like to take up this point about Trident and about our independent nuclear deterrent. I think it would be completely wrong to try and trade off equipping our forces properly today, which must be done, with securing our future for the future. And I think it's one of the biggest decisions any Prime Minister would have to take, and we've got to get this right. And I profoundly believe that we are safer having an independent nuclear deterrent in an unsafe and uncertain world, a proper replacement to Trident, because we simply don't know what the world will look like in 40 years' time.
Well, indeed.
And I think it's a real risk, as the Liberal Democrats say, first to be opposed to an independent nuclear deterrent,
No.
now to say they do want one, but it's not the same as Trident, but they can't tell us what it is. Well, you can't take risks with this. It's really important we get it right.
If you don't believe me, then believe the several generals who wrote just this week in the newspaper saying precisely what I've been saying all along. Why take a decision now to commit that amount of money on replacing an old Cold War nuclear missile system when that system has still got several years to run, when those military people themselves say that there are cheaper and better alternatives, and of course, most importantly, when the world is changing. President Obama said last week, I think quite rightly, that now the greatest threat to us is not the Cold War threats of old, it's terrorists getting hold of dirty bombs. Trident isn't going to help you with that. Nick. So let's move with the times, take decisions when we need to take them, and at least have this review, which I talked about after the election, where we then consider everything that is possible.
I have to deal with these decisions every day, and I say to you, Nick, get real. Get real, because Iran, you're saying, might be able to have a nuclear weapon, and you wouldn't take action against them. But you're saying that we've got to give up our Trident submarines and our nuclear weapon now. Now get real about the danger that we face if we have North Korea, Iran and other countries with nuclear weapons and we give up our own.
Real, what is dangerous is to commit to spend a whole lot of money that we might not have on a system which almost certainly won't help when the world is changing, when we're facing new threats, when now more and more military experts are saying that there are different alternatives. You want to hold a review and you want to exclude the one big issue which should be right at the heart of that review.
I thought I'd never utter these words, but I agree with Gordon. You cannot put off this decision. General Mike Jackson said today we can't go on putting off the decision. You have to make it early. You have to keep your country safe and secure. You cannot rustle up a nuclear deterrent at the last minute, as the Liberal Democrats seem to think you can. It's deeply unsafe.
We're going to move on now to the next question, which comes from Nicola Tanner from Hallfield in Bristol.
Given that climate change is one of the biggest global threats that we face, what have you personally done in the last 6 months to use more environmentally friendly and sustainable forms of transport, such as bikes and trains, rather than cars and planes?
So what are you doing personally to tackle climate change? Gordon Brown.
I've been on trains all the time. I don't think I've been on any more than one plane during this election campaign. I've been going around by train. And I think, actually, our high-speed rail network will allow people to get off the roads and also to get off domestic air flights, and I think that's incredibly important. I would say the other thing I've done, and I'm very pleased that we managed to do this in our home in North Queensferry, is that we thought, living on a hill with a huge amount of wind, not very good weather in Scotland, as you know, that a wind turbine would be the answer. In fact, we found that far better, even in this area where there's not much sun, is a solar panel. And I would recommend people, if they can, to use this form of energy because it allows us to heat our water in a way that is far more environmentally friendly. We've got the first climate change act in the world. We're due to reduce emissions substantially by 2020 and 2030. There is a lot more to be done, both individually and as a community, but we've also got to get a world agreement. We've got to work, David, with Europe to do so and work with the rest of the world, and that's the way to get environmental emissions down.
Thank you, David Cameron.
Well, when I said to my party we had to get real about the environment and we had to be a party that was a blue-green party, not just a blue party, I did actually once get a letter from someone who didn't really agree with this and said, Mr Cameron, if you're so concerned about carbon emissions, why don't you just stop breathing? And that was a moment that I realised I still had some persuasion to do. In terms of my own life, the biggest thing we've done is actually to have proper insulation in our house, and actually it really can cut your energy bill and make life cheaper as well as greener. But I would say in the last 6 months, the biggest change, or the last year, the biggest change that I've been able to make is actually coming out very strongly against the third runway at Heathrow. I think it is wrong to do that. I think we should be going for high-speed rail instead. We should be having a high-speed rail hub at Heathrow and trying to make sure that all those flights that people take where you could take a train, it's possible to do that. I think it'll be a really big step forward.
Thank you. Nick Clegg.
Well, Nicola, I suspect I'm like many people. I, of course, try to change my behaviour. When I travel up to my constituency in Sheffield and back again every week, I almost always do that by train, unless there's so much clobber with the kids that I simply can't carry it on the train. But I don't do enough. I'm acutely aware I don't do enough. I think I'm like many, many people. I wish I could and would do more. I think part of the problem, because you referred specifically, Nicola, to aeroplanes, and you're quite right that flights, at least when they're able to fly, and there isn't too much volcanic ash around, do create a growing proportion of the total of CO2 emissions. So we need to tackle it. And I think what is irrational is at the moment you have a tax system which taxes passengers in aeroplanes. And that means that planes with freight in them, for instance, aren't taxed to represent, to reflect the pollution they've caused. You've got lots of planes that are half empty or barely got any passengers at all. I think if you change that to a per plane tax, you'd make a dramatic difference in cutting down on unnecessary aviation pollution.
Thank you, Gordon Brown.
If we're going to make a real difference, we've got to change the energy balance in our country. And we've got to remove this fixation about using oil, our addiction to oil, our dependence on oil. And that's why our energy plan talks about how we can move with nuclear and renewables and oil and gas. We want 15% renewables by 2020. We're the world's leading offshore wind power at the moment, and we want to do more in every area for renewables. So the questions I have to ask the two other parties is this. Why, Nick, are you so against nuclear power? Because it is the means by which we can balance off our energy supply without having the dependence on oil. And David, why don't you have a renewables target as we do so that we can use wind power? Why are you so against the onshore wind power that people are trying to develop? You seem to support it in principle, but in every constituency where it happens, you seem to be against it. Let's get real also about getting this energy balance right.
David Cameron.
Well, of course we need an energy balance, and we need nuclear, we need renewables, we need the full range, and it's a great opportunity, actually, for our country to do these things. But I think one of the biggest opportunities we've got is actually with our own homes, and we have a proposal called the Green Deal, where we want to say to everyone in this country that you could spend up to £6,500 on your home to insulate it and better protect it. And then you can see your energy bills come down. And we will have companies, and Marks and Spencers and others have expressed an interest, to come and carry out that work and to pay for it and to share with you the reduction in the bills. I think that would show people that going green actually can save you money, it can actually get Britain working again, it can cut carbon emissions, it can cut fuel poverty. For all those reasons, I'd want it to be a really big part of the First Queen's speech if I'm elected as your Prime Minister.
The only problem, David, is we're doing it already.
Mr Brown, you're going to get your turn in a moment, but for now it's Nick Clegg.
Hold your horses. You've asked, Gordon Brown asked me about nuclear power. I don't have a sort of theological opposition to nuclear power. I just think it's extraordinarily expensive. Very, very expensive indeed. There are some calculations that it would lead to average energy bills actually increasing in this country rather than decreasing. And it takes a long, long, long time to build these new nuclear plants. All the experts agree that it would take well into the next decade to create new nuclear energy, which would be too late to deal with the energy problems we have now. For a fraction of the money that I think both David Cameron and Gordon Brown want to spend on subsidising the nuclear industry, we could develop a mass insulation programs of our homes, of our schools, schools and our hospitals. Remember, 27% of all carbon dioxide emissions in this country go straight out of your window through the roof of your house. If we only used energy more efficiently and also, of course, invested some of the money which would be wasted on big nuclear projects, on wind energy and other renewable energies, I think that is the way towards a sustainable future.
You can't have a balanced energy policy in the modern world, as almost every country is now finding in the advanced world, without using nuclear power. And I do say that the schemes that we've introduced, I met some young guys yesterday and girls who've been working on an energy project in Wales. They've been taken on as a result of our Future Jobs Fund, and they're in the business of helping insulation and giving people advice about the use of energy. So we're trying to do this at the moment, and we will do more in future years. Yes, we've got to insulate our houses. Yes, we've got to have carbon-free homes where possible. Yes, we've got to have the electric car. We're investing in that, to the hybrid car. And yes, we've got to develop offshore wind power. But the energy balance has got to be fair, and any party that is now excluding nuclear power, which is already a substantial part of our country, is not really thinking about the needs of a future where we cannot be dependent on these high oil prices forever.
Well, actually, the situation is worse than Gordon Brown describes, because actually, according to the government's own figures, we are potentially heading for power cuts in 2017. And actually, nuclear power stations won't really come on stream by then. So we actually have a greater emergency, and we do need to look at the level of gas storage we have in this country, which is much lower than France or Germany. They have up to 100 days, and we have a little over 2 weeks. And we also need to make sure that we get the renewables and maybe even extra gas capacity on stream faster. Otherwise, we can see the lights go out. That's because we've had, over the last 13 years, so many different strategies and so little action.
Can I just, one thing that hasn't been mentioned at all, which is absolutely crucial, of course, to dealing with a global problem, is acting globally. I remember seeing the television pictures of Gordon Brown sitting, I have to say, slightly sort of on the sidelines in the summit in Copenhagen, while America and China basically cut everybody else out. And I think if you're going to lead on this, of course you have to lead at home, but you also have to lead in Europe. There's no point clubbing together, as David Cameron has done, with people who even deny the existence of climate change in Europe. You've got to create strength in numbers in Europe so that we can really lead in the world, because this is a global problem which requires a global response.
But Nick, you're right. There is no British-only solution, and David's got to face up to that. But you've also got to face up to the fact that the cooperation that we have achieved, 100 countries have now signed carbon emission reduction plans. We're trying to persuade China and America to do so. We need America on our side. Your anti-Americanism will not help us. We need to work with all the different continents to get a climate change agreement.
Just one point on the European issue. There's a bit of a con going on here as well. The Lisbon Treaty has just about 7 words on climate change. You don't need another treaty for politicians to get together in different countries. You need political will. You need action.
Of course
That's what is required. Instead, what we keep getting from the other two parties is more institutions, more regulation, more new agreements. That's not what's required. It's action at the European level, and that requires political will.
Of course you don't need a new treaty, but you do need to at least work with people in Europe who believe that climate change exists. That would be a helpful start. On the point that Gordon Brown keeps saying that of anti-Americanism, I have a very simple attitude towards our relationship with America. It's an immensely, immensely important special relationship, but it shouldn't be a one-way street. We shouldn't always automatically do what our American friends tell us to do. We've got to make sure that we act on the world stage in our interests, not simply at the beck and call of anybody else.
And I persuaded the Americans to be part of a G20 that dealt with the banking crisis, and I'm still pushing the Americans to take action on climate change as well. But David, I mean, your anti-Europeanism becomes more and more obvious as this debate goes on. It's the big society at home, but it's the little Britain abroad. I think you've got to rethink your policies.
I just think they're just trying to frighten you, the other two parties, because they don't want actually a Britain that stands up for itself in Europe. They keep going on about these alliances. One of our main allies is the party of the Polish president, who tragically died in that accident, who both the politician standing next to me praised as a great patriot and a great statesman. So I think we can hear no more of that. The fact is you can cooperate and work with your European partners without signing a new treaty, without giving away so many new powers.
That is going to be the last word on Europe for now, though I suspect it will come up later on. Let's move on now. And a question from Michael Jeans, who's from central Bristol.
Good evening. The Pope has accepted an invitation to make an official state visit to Britain in September at the cost of millions of pounds to taxpayers. If you win the election, will you disassociate your party from the Pope's protection over many years of Catholic priests who were ultimately tried and convicted of child abuse, and from his fierce opposition to all contraception, embryonic stem cell research, treatment for childless couples, gay equality and the routine use of condoms when HIV is at an all-time high.
Thank you, Michael. So, do you back the Pope's visit, David Cameron?
Well, I do think it's welcome that the Pope is coming to Britain, and I would, if I was your Prime Minister, I would want to support that visit and make sure I could do everything in my power to make it a success. There are millions of people in our country who will welcome that, who share the Pope's Catholic faith, and I think we should try and make a success of it. But do I agree with everything the Pope says? No, I don't agree with him about contraception. I don't agree with him about homosexuality. And I think the Catholic Church has got some very, very serious work to do to unearth and come to terms with some of the appalling things that have happened. And they need to do that. But I do think we should respect people of faith. I think faith is important in our country. I think faith-based organizations, whether they are Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu, do amazing things in our country, whether it's working in our prisons or providing good schools or actually helping some of the most vulnerable people in our country. So a country where faith is welcome, yes. A good visit from the Pope, yes. But does that mean we have to agree with everything he says? No.
Nick Clegg.
My wife, I'm not a man of faith, but my wife is, Miriam is Catholic. My children are being brought up in her faith. So I have a little bit of an insight into the immense feelings of anguish in the Catholic community here and elsewhere. And I think many Catholics themselves feel really, extremely torn apart by what's happened. And I think they do want to see the Catholic Church express greater openness and repentance. You can't keep a lid on sin. And of course you need to move with the times. I do welcome the Pope's visit, but I hope by the time he does visit, there is a greater recognition that there has been terrible, terrible suffering. There have been abusive relationships which have left immeasurable scars on individual people's lives, and we need a process of openness and then healing. You can't undo the tragedies of the past, but you can be open about them so people can start to move on.
Gordon Brown.
I've met some of the people who have rightly complained about the abuse that they were subject to when young, and it never leaves them. It's something that is with them always. And no matter what you can try to do to help, there is always this problem that they have to face up to every day, that they were abused, cruelly abused, by people in whom they placed their faith and trust. So the Church has got to deal with these problems, and it's got to make sure that there is an open and clean confession about what has happened, and that we help those people who've been put into difficulty by this abuse. But I welcome the Pope's visit to Britain, and I want him to come to Britain for two reasons. One is the Catholic Church is a great part of our society, and we should recognize it as such. And I hope every British citizen wants to see this visit by the Pope take place. And secondly, we must break down the barriers of religion that exist in our world. The faiths must come together and recognize that they have common values and common interests. They all believe that we should be good neighbors to each other. I'm from the Presbyterian religion, but I support the visit, but I not only support it, I want religious faiths to work more closely together.
Before we bring in David Cameron, I would remind you that Michael Jeans is also concerned about the attitude of the Catholic Church to science and also to gender matters. David Cameron.
Well, again, I would say to Michael that, again, I would be agreeing with you and against the Pope in terms of, for instance, the need to make advances in science. I don't think we should. Obviously, you need proper protections and proper rules, and we debated them at great length in the House of Commons, but I do want to see that go ahead. Also on the issue of abortion. So there are lots of areas I don't agree, but I don't think that means you should stop someone visiting our country or condemn them. We must try and build a open and tolerant country where we respect people for their different faiths, we bring faiths closer together with each other, and we're prepared to have an open and frank discussion about these things. I think that's the only way to go, and it's nice to hear that pretty much actually we all agree about that.
Mr Clegg.
No, I think on this matter we do. I don't agree. I've made it publicly clear in the past that I don't agree with the formal doctrine on homosexuality of the Catholic Church, for instance. I don't agree with it at all. It doesn't mean I don't. I think there should be some uprising against the Pope's visit, quite the reverse. I would like to see the Pope here. I think the Catholic community in Britain wants to welcome him, but as I think we've all acknowledged, that doesn't mean one has to subscribe to the every letter and every cross T and every dotted I of the theology and doctrine of that church.
You know, on all these big issues, I think we're proving ourselves to be a tolerant and understanding nation. We introduced civil partnerships, and therefore we changed the laws on homosexuality and said to people, if you're gay or straight, you have a place in British society. And I think for many people that was a great liberation, and I'm pleased that it has happened in Britain in these last few years. On human embryology, I've disagreed with the Catholic Church, because I believe if you can treat a disease by using embryos that are enabling us to make sure that people can be free of some of the conditions that afflict their lives, we should do so under the right rules. And I'm sorry that in principle there is a disagreement with the Church on that. On the question of contraception, I think we know that in Africa, we know around the world that it's important to give women access and choice so that they can make their own decisions. And I regret the fact that the Catholic Church does not do that. But the Pope should come to Britain, we should have these debates, and we should welcome all religions, because bringing religions together is the key to making sure that we have a more peaceful world.
OK, thank you. Given the degree of agreement, we're going to move on now and take some more questions. That brings to an end the international affairs part of this debate, although we may well come back to it in subsequent questions. And in a moment, we're going to move on to the open section. But before we do that, just a reminder that you can see the Sky News Scotland debate this Sunday. It'll feature senior politicians from 3 parties represented here, plus the First Minister of Scotland, the SNP's Alex Salmond. So please join me live from Edinburgh at my next gig. That's this Sunday at 10.